Welcome to Quiet Chronicles, the place where history gets to breathe again, slow and unhurried, until it feels less like something you're studying and more like something you're simply present for. Wherever you are tonight, let yourself settle into it fully. Maybe you're already under the covers, phone propped somewhere it can't fall on you, the room dark except for whatever small glow is keeping you company. Maybe you're still catching your breath from the day, letting your shoulders drop for the first time in hours. However you've arrived here, take a moment before we begin. Let your body sink into the mattress. Let your jaw unclench. There is nowhere else you need to be and nothing left to solve tonight. This next stretch of time belongs only to you and to a life lived a long time ago, one that's about to unfold slowly enough for you to drift right along with it. Here's a strange thing to sit with before we start. The man who once lit an entire World's Fair, who helped wire the modern world for power it still runs on today, died alone in a hotel room, several floors up, with barely enough money left to cover the rent. His closest companions in those final years were pigeons he fed by hand in the park. The gap between those two images, the blazing public triumph and the quiet private ending, is where tonight's story lives. If you find yourself coming back to these chronicles night after night, consider subscribing so you never lose your place in line for the next one. And if tonight's story moves you, a like helps more people find their way here too. For those who'd like to support the channel more directly, you'll find a link to our Patreon down in the description. Tonight we're tracing the full arc of that life, from a lightning-struck birth in a small mountain village to a mind that reshaped how the entire world moves electricity and how light. Let the room settle a little further. Let's begin. Chapter 1: Storm Born. The storm arrived at midnight, rolling down off the mountains toward the small village of Smiljan, and inside a modest house near the church, a woman was already deep in labor. Lightning split the sky in long white cracks, and thunder rattled the shutters hard enough that a servant girl crossed herself and muttered that no child should be born under such a sky. The midwife disagreed. As the boy finally came into the world, one particularly violent flash lit the room from edge to edge, and the servant girl declared he would be a child of the storm, cursed by it. His mother, still catching her breath, corrected her at once. He would be a child of light, she said, and the name given to him a few days later, in the summer of 1856, was Nikola. The Tesla household sat in the Austrian Empire's military frontier, a strip of land in the region of Lika where Serbian families like Nikola's had settled generations earlier to guard the border against the Ottomans. His father, Nikola Tesla, was an Orthodox priest, a man known locally for his sharp tongue and sharper memory, capable of reciting long passages of scripture and poetry without ever glancing at a page. He had wanted his own father's path for a while and then abandoned it, choosing instead to become a man of words rather than a soldier. Milutin expected the same devotion to language and precision from his children, and he drilled young Nikola in logic puzzles and mental arithmetic almost as soon as the boy could talk. It was not always affectionate. It was, however, formative. Nikola's mother, Duca Mandich came from a long line of Orthodox clergy herself, though her gifts ran in a different direction entirely. She could not read, having never been formally taught, yet she memorized entire epic poems after a single hearing and recited them back without error. More than that, she built things. Duca constructed her own tools for weaving and cooking, tinkered endlessly with household mechanisms, and later in life even sketched an improved egg beater that a neighbor eventually manufactured. Nikola would say decades afterward that whatever capacity he had for invention came from her, not from his father's books. Above Nikola stood an older brother, Dane, gifted in ways that made the whole household certain he would become someone remarkable. Dane could sketch, reason, and charm adults twice his age, and their parents made little effort to hide which son they expected great things from. Nikola, several years younger, absorbed this quietly, the way children do, filing away the comparison without yet having words for how it felt. Their relationship, in the accounts that survive, was ordinary in the way older and younger sibling relationships usually are, marked by both closeness and rivalry. Then, when Nikola was around 5 years old, Dane died. The accepted version of events, passed down through the family, involved a fall from a horse the boy had been forbidden to ride, resulting in injuries he did not recover from. Grief settled over the household like a weather system that refused to move on. Milutin, in particular, withdrew into a mourning so total that for a period he seemed barely present to his surviving children at all. For Nikola, the loss did something stranger than simple sorrow. He later described watching his parents grieve a golden, promising son while he himself remained, alive but somehow lesser in comparison, a shadow standing where a light used to be. Any small failure of his own in the months after felt magnified by that absence. He grew determined, in a way children rarely articulate but often feel, to prove that he too could be extraordinary. That determination did not fade with age. If anything, it hardened into something closer to a private engine driving him for the rest of his life. The family soon relocated to the nearby town of Gospic, where Milutin took up a new post, and the change of scenery did little to lighten the mood at home. Nikola, meanwhile, began exhibiting behaviors that unsettled the adults around him. He described seeing flashes of light accompanying ordinary words and images, bright enough at times to obscure the real objects in front of him. Modern accounts often frame these as a form of synesthesia layered with intense visual imagination, though no such vocabulary existed for the family to use at the time. To them, it simply looked like a nervous, overly sensitive boy. His early schooling in Gospic introduced him to arithmetic and to the sciences in a formal way for the first time, and he took to both with unusual speed. Teachers noted that he could perform complicated calculations in his head, seemingly without effort, while other students still worked through the numbers on slate. He also began building small models and devices in his spare time, water wheels and simple motors fashioned from whatever scraps he could find around the house and yard. One early attempt, a small motor powered by June bugs he had glued to a rotating disc, ended when a friend recoiled at the cruelty of it and destroyed the contraption. Nikola never repeated the experiment, though he remembered it vividly for the rest of his life. Illness found him early as well. As a boy, he suffered a serious bout of cholera during a regional outbreak, one severe enough that his family began preparing for the worst. Milutin, desperate, reportedly promised that if Nikola recovered, he would be allowed to attend engineering school instead of following his father into the priesthood, a career the boy had shown no enthusiasm for. Nikola did recover slowly, and he held his father to that promise for years afterward, treating it as something closer to a covenant than an offhand deal made in a moment of fear. Fire threatened the town more than once during his childhood, and on one occasion Nikola later credited himself, perhaps with some youthful embellishment, for helping save a burning fire engine's pumping mechanism when the local brigade could not get it working. Whether the story was entirely accurate or slightly polished by memory hardly mattered to the people who repeated it. It fit a pattern the town had already begun to notice. The priest's younger son had a strange gift for machines, for seeing how their parts fit together, and this in a place with no engineering school, no laboratory, and precious few books on the subject. Books, when he could get them, consumed him completely. He read voraciously in whatever language the material happened to be in, teaching himself pieces of several languages simply because a particular text existed only in that tongue. His father, worried about the boy's obsessive reading habits interfering with his health, at one point confiscated candles so Nikola could not read after dark. Nikola responded by making his own candles in secret and reading late into the night regardless, hidden behind a blanket hung over the window. Restriction, for him, rarely produced obedience. It produced ingenuity instead. Around this same period, his uncles on his mother's side became notable in his memory as well, one a mathematics professor and another a career military officer who had also written on logic and probability. Visits from them brought a different kind of intellectual air into the household, one less concerned with scripture and more with systems, numbers, and proofs. Nikola gravitated toward these conversations whenever he could, listening from doorways when he was not directly included. It planted in him early on the sense that the world could be understood, piece by piece, if a person was only patient and rigorous enough to look closely. The region itself shaped him in less obvious ways. Laika was a place of harsh winters, rocky ground, and a fierce local pride rooted in generations of border defense against outside armies. Serbian Orthodox identity ran deep in families like the Teslas, wound tightly together with language, liturgy, and a long oral tradition of epic poetry recited at gatherings. Nikola absorbed all of it, the religious cadence of his father's sermons and the melodic memory of his mother's poems, both settling somewhere in the architecture of his mind. Later in life, he would credit this unusual mixture, equal parts discipline and imagination, for the peculiar way his own thinking worked. By adolescence, his sensitivity to bright flashes and vivid mental images had not disappeared, but he was learning to manage it. He discovered that if he pictured a mechanism clearly enough in his mind, down to every rotating part, he could test and refine it there before ever touching a physical tool. This internal workshop, as he later called similar habits, would become one of the defining features of his adult inventive process. Even as a boy in Gospic, He was already rehearsing the very method that would one day let him design an alternating current motor almost entirely inside his own head, years before he built one with his hands. School authorities eventually recognized that Gospich had little left to teach him, and the conversation turned toward where he should study next. Nikola pushed hard for engineering, invoking his father's cholera bed promise at every opportunity, while Milutin quietly hoped the boy's enthusiasm might still cool into something more conventional. It did not cool. If anything, the pressure of his brother's memory and his own hunger to be extraordinary only intensified the closer he came to leaving home. The next chapter of his education, in the industrial city of Graz, would test both his brilliance and his self-control in ways Gospich never could. Chapter 2: The Fevers of Graz. Graz in the autumn of 1875 looked like nothing Nikola had ever lived inside before. Gospich had been small and slow, wrapped in mountains and church bells, while Graz hummed with rail lines, gaslit streets, and the particular restlessness of a city built around industry. He arrived at the Austrian Polytechnic School with a scholarship secured through his father's connections and a head full of ambitions he had been rehearsing for years. The engineering program felt, at first, like exactly the covenant Milutin had promised him back on that cholera bed. Nothing about the first weeks suggested how badly that promise was about to strain. He threw himself into his coursework with an intensity that alarmed even his professors, who were not easily alarmed by diligent students. Classmates later remembered him rising before dawn and working past midnight, attending nearly every lecture available across multiple engineering disciplines at once. One professor reportedly wrote to his father, warning that the young man risked killing himself through sheer overwork. Nikola brushed off the concern entirely. He believed, with the stubborn confidence of someone still young enough to think exhaustion was simply the price of greatness, that sleep was for people with lesser things to accomplish. It was during a physics lecture on direct current machinery that something shifted in him permanently. The professor demonstrated a Gram dynamo, a device that generated direct current using a commutator, a mechanical switch responsible for constantly reversing current flow inside the rotating armature. Sparks flew visibly from the commutator brushes as the machine ran, a small violent shower accompanying every rotation. Nikola watched closely and asked why the design required such an inefficient spark-throwing mechanism at all. Could the commutator simply be removed? His professor, a man named Poschel, found the question almost amusing. Direct current motors needed the commutator by their very nature, he explained, since the current had to be mechanically reversed for the rotor to keep turning in one direction. Removing it would be roughly equivalent to trying to build a perpetual motion machine, an impossibility dressed up as an engineering problem. He said this in front of the entire class, and laughter followed. The easy laughter of students confirming among themselves that their eager young classmate had finally overreached. Nikola did not laugh along. He sat with the humiliation and, quietly, refused to accept the answer as final. The idea would not leave him alone after that. For years afterward, he returned to the question in idle moments, turning it over the way a person worries at a loose thread on a coat. If alternating current could be generated instead of direct current, he reasoned, and if a rotating magnetic field could somehow be produced without any mechanical switching at all, the entire commutator problem might simply dissolve. He had no diagrams yet, no functioning theory, nothing but a stubborn conviction that his professor's confident dismissal had been wrong. That conviction sat dormant for the better part of a decade, waiting for the right conditions to surface again. Meanwhile, his academic discipline began to erode in ways that had nothing to do with electrical theory. Graz offered a university social life full of taverns, billiard halls, and card games, and Tesla, freed for the first time from his father's close supervision, discovered he had a genuine taste for gambling. It started modestly enough. A few evenings spent at cards among friends, harmless by most standards. The habit deepened quickly, though, pulling hours away from his studies and money away from his scholarship stipend. He would later describe the compulsion candidly, admitting that the thrill of risk had, for a period, rivaled his fascination with machines. His coursework suffered as the gambling consumed more of his attention and his nights. Grades that had once been exceptional slid toward mediocrity, and by his third year at the Polytechnic, he had stopped attending several of his classes altogether. The scholarship funding from Lika's military frontier authorities, which depended on continued academic standing, was quietly at risk of being pulled. Letters from concerned relatives began arriving with more frequency, though whether Nikola read them carefully at the time is difficult to say. He seemed, for a stretch of months, to be drifting away from the very future he had fought his father so hard to secure. Money troubles compounded the situation directly. He borrowed from friends to cover gambling losses, then borrowed again to cover the first round of debts, a pattern that spirals quickly for anyone caught inside it. Some accounts describe a particularly severe losing streak that left him owing sums he had no way of repaying through ordinary means. Rather than confessing the full extent of it to his family, he tried at times to win his way back out, chasing losses with the same stubborn logic he later refused to apply to failed motor designs. It did not work. Eventually, the truth reached his parents, in whatever partial or distorted form travels through worried letters across a continent. Milutin, by most accounts, was devastated rather than furious, having placed enormous faith in his son's academic future. Duca reportedly sent money at one point specifically to help cover his debts, an act of quiet parental rescue that Tesla remembered with lasting shame. He later insisted that he eventually conquered the gambling impulse entirely, through sheer force of will, and never touched cards again for the rest of his life. Whether that recovery was as immediate and total as he claimed, historians still debate, but the habit does vanish almost entirely from later accounts of his adult life. By the end of his third year, the Polytechnic's records show something stark. Tesla never actually completed his degree there. He left Graz without graduating, a fact he would spend years afterward obscuring or reframing in conversations and interviews. Financial pressure, mounting coursework failures, and the accumulated embarrassment of his gambling likely all played a role in the decision. Whatever the precise mixture of causes, the young man who left Graz was noticeably different from the eager scholarship student who had arrived barely 3 years earlier. The departure was not calm or well planned. Some accounts suggest he left rather abruptly, cutting contact with friends and family for a period that worried everyone who cared about him. There were rumors, never fully confirmed, that he had considered ending his life during this dark stretch, overwhelmed by debt, failure, and the collapse of the academic path his father had sacrificed so much to grant him. Whatever the precise truth of those rumors, the period clearly marked the lowest point of his young adulthood. He seemed, briefly, to have squandered everything. Yet even during this unraveling, the electrical question from Poschel's lecture never fully left his mind. Friends who saw him during this period sometimes noted him sketching odd diagrams on scraps of paper, half-formed ideas about magnetic fields and rotation that he could not yet articulate clearly even to himself. It was as though two entirely separate Teslas existed simultaneously that year, one drowning in cards and debt, the other quietly continuing to chip away at a problem the rest of the world considered already settled. Neither version fully understood, yet, how the other would eventually resolve things. His family, for their part, remained largely unaware of just how close their son had come to genuine collapse. Milutin's letters from this period reflect concern but not despair, suggesting Tesla had managed to shield the worst of it from home, even as he shared enough to explain his need for money. Distance and unreliable postal service across the empire made real oversight nearly impossible in any case. Whatever guidance his parents might have offered, it would have arrived too late or too vague to change much. He was, for better or worse, entirely on his own in Graz. Eventually, contact between Tesla and his family thinned to almost nothing for a stretch of time, a silence that later biographers have found difficult to fully explain. Some believe he was too ashamed to write home honestly about his failures. Others suggest he was simply consumed by whatever chaotic period followed his departure from the Polytechnic, uncertain himself what his next step should even be. The gap in the historical record here is real, and no amount of retrospective tidying quite fills it. What is certain is that the confident young man who had once corrected a servant girl's superstition through his very name was, by his early 20s, adrift. The next fixed point in his story would come in Budapest, where fate, exhaustion, and a stubborn decade-old physics question would finally collide. Before that could happen, though, Tesla needed to find his footing again, somewhere far from the taverns and gambling halls that had nearly ended him. Graz had given him both a wound and a question, humiliation on one hand and an unsolved problem on the other. Both would travel with him wherever he went next. Neither had finished shaping him yet. Chapter 3: The Vision in the Park. Budapest received Tesla in 1881 as a city mid-transformation, its streets threading between old imperial stonework and the newer machinery of a rapidly modernizing telegraph network. He arrived with the help of a family friend, Anthony Szigeti, who helped secure him a position with the Budapest Telephone Exchange, a company still being organized rather than one already running smoothly. The job promised steady work in a field adjacent to his old fascination with electricity. It also promised, at least on paper, a way to rebuild a reputation that Graz had quietly damaged. What it delivered first, however, was an entirely different kind of ordeal. Before the exchange work truly began, Tesla suffered what he and later biographers describe as a severe nervous breakdown. His senses turned unbearably acute during this period, to the point where he claimed he could hear a watch ticking in another room, or feel a train passing miles away as a physical vibration through his body. Ordinary sunlight became almost painful to endure, and even a soft touch on his skin sometimes registered as overwhelming. Doctors at the time had little useful language for what he was experiencing, offering diagnoses that amounted to little more than educated guesses. Tesla himself later attributed part of the collapse to years of overwork stretching back through his final unraveling months in Graz. Szigety stayed close through the worst of it, a steady presence when Tesla's body and mind seemed to be working against each other. He encouraged long walks, insisting that physical movement might help settle whatever storm was raging beneath the surface. Tesla resisted the suggestion at first, convinced that walking would do nothing for a mind he felt was fundamentally broken. Eventually, worn down by his friend's persistence, he agreed to try it. That decision would turn out to matter more than either of them could have predicted. The walks did help gradually, restoring some measure of physical strength even as his mental state remained fragile and unpredictable. Weeks passed this way, Szigety and Tesla moving through Budapest's parks and boulevards, while conversation drifted between science, philosophy, and whatever half-formed thoughts surfaced along the way. Tesla later described feeling as though his mind, once so reliable, had become a stranger to him during this stretch. Slowly, though, something in him began to reassemble. The old question from Poschel's lecture, dormant since Graz, started stirring again beneath the surface of his recovery. One particular afternoon, the exact date lost to memory, but the scene itself burned permanently into his recollection. Tesla and Szigety were walking through Budapest's city park as the sun began setting. Tesla was reciting from memory lines from Goethe's Faust, a habit he retained from his father's insistence on memorization years earlier. Mid-recitation, without warning, the old unsolved problem of the commutator returned to him, not as an abstract question this time, but as a complete working image. He stopped walking entirely. In his mind, he later said, he saw a rotating magnetic field forming from two or more alternating currents offset from each other, spinning without any need for a mechanical commutator at all. The image arrived whole, he claimed, not built piece by piece through deliberate reasoning, but assembled instantly, the way a long-held tension sometimes resolves all at once. He grabbed a stick from the ground and began sketching the concept directly into the dirt path in front of him, unable to wait even the short walk home. Szigety watched, understanding perhaps only half of what his friend was so frantically drawing. The sketch itself has not survived, but the moment became one of the most frequently retold scenes in Tesla's entire life story. What Tesla had glimpsed, in essence, was the foundation of the induction motor and the broader principle of the rotating magnetic field, an idea that would eventually underpin the entire alternating current system he later built his career around. Where Poschel's classroom had insisted direct current motors needed their sparking commutators by necessity, Tesla now saw a path around that necessity altogether. Multiple alternating currents, properly timed and offset, could generate a magnetic field that itself rotated, pulling a rotor along with it smoothly and without any mechanical switching. It solved, in one stroke, the exact problem his professor had once dismissed as roughly equivalent to perpetual motion. He would spend years turning that park sketch into working machinery, but the core insight itself had arrived complete in a matter of seconds. His health continued improving in the weeks that followed, as though the resolved question had lifted some of the pressure weighing on his nervous system. He returned to more regular work, eventually taking up a formal position with the Budapest Telephone Exchange as it moved from planning into actual operation. There, he applied himself with the technical precision that had always come naturally to him when his mind wasn't fighting itself. He is credited, in some accounts, with designing improvements to the telephone repeater used in the exchange's equipment, though records from this period remain thinner than for his later, more famous years. The job itself was modest. The mind now working through it, however, had already glimpsed something far larger. Word of Tesla's technical abilities began circulating among the small, interconnected community of electrical engineers working across Europe at the time. The Continental Edison Company, expanding its telephone and lighting operations across the continent, was actively recruiting talented engineers wherever it could find them. Tibor Puskás, a Hungarian engineer with ties to the Edison organization, took notice of Tesla's abilities and helped arrange an opportunity in Paris. For Tesla, the offer represented a chance to leave behind both the site of his breakdown and the lingering shadow of his unfinished education. Paris, in 1882, would become the next stage of a career now finally beginning to gather real momentum. Before departing, Tesla reportedly built a rough working model demonstrating the induction motor principle, using whatever materials he could gather to prove, even crudely, that the vision from the park was mechanically sound. Accounts of exactly how developed this early model was vary considerably between sources. What remains consistent, however, is Tesla's own unwavering confidence that he had solved something significant, regardless of whether anyone else around him fully grasped its importance yet. He carried that certainty with him as he left Budapest, a conviction that would need to survive years of skepticism, indifference, and outright dismissal before the wider world caught up to it. The breakdown itself left a lasting mark on how Tesla understood his own mind for the rest of his life. He came away from it believing his nervous system operated on a different, more heightened register than most people's, capable of both extraordinary sensitivity and extraordinary insight. Whether this self-assessment reflected genuine neurological difference or simply the particular way he chose to narrate his own experience, later observers have never fully settled. Tesla himself never seemed to doubt it. The Budapest collapse, painful as it clearly was, became in his own retelling less a weakness to hide and more a strange gift he had barely survived long enough to use. Szigety's role in this chapter of Tesla's life deserves particular attention, even though history remembers him only faintly compared to the men Tesla would later work alongside. It was Szigety's patient insistence on those daily walks that arguably created the conditions for the city park breakthrough to occur at all. Without that steady companionship through the worst of the breakdown, There is no way to know whether Tesla's mind would have found its way back to the commutator problem when it did, or whether the collapse might have taken a darker turn entirely. Friendship, in this period of Tesla's life, functioned as a kind of quiet infrastructure beneath the more dramatic scientific breakthrough. History tends to remember the sketch in the dirt. It remembers the friend who kept him walking far less often. Leaving Budapest meant leaving behind the site of both his lowest point and his clearest moment of insight, a strange pairing to carry forward into a new country and a new job. Tesla arrived in Paris later in 1882, still a relatively unknown young engineer despite the magnitude of what he now privately understood about alternating current. The Continental Edison Company offered steady, respectable work, repairing and improving the lighting and power systems the organization was installing across the city. It gave him no obvious platform, yet for the induction motor idea itself. That platform would take considerably more time, more setbacks, and one crucial letter of introduction before it finally arrived. Looking back at Budapest from any later point in his career, Tesla never described the breakdown and the breakthrough as separate events, so much as two halves of a single turning point. The collapse had, in its own brutal way, cleared space in his mind for an old, stubborn question to finally resolve itself. Whatever Graz had cost him, in humiliation and debt and reputation, Budapest returned something arguably more valuable, a foundational insight he would spend the rest of his working life refining, defending, and building into functioning machinery. He left the city changed, carrying with him equal parts fragility and certainty. Both would travel with him all the way to Paris, and eventually across an ocean he had not yet imagined crossing. Chapter 4: Paris and the Edison Letter. Paris in late 1882 was already a city wired for the future, its streets and shop fronts increasingly lit by arc lamps as the Continental Edison Company expanded across Europe. Tesla arrived to take a position as an ordinary engineer, tasked with repairing and improving lighting installations across the city. The work was modest compared to the vision he still carried from Budapest. It paid steadily, though, and placed him inside a functioning branch of the era's most important electrical enterprise. His talent for diagnosing electrical faults quickly set him apart from most colleagues around him. Company engineers were regularly dispatched to troubleshoot power stations experiencing mysterious failures, and Tesla built a reputation for solving problems others had abandoned. One frequently repeated account involves a plant in Strasbourg, plagued by recurring damage no one on site could properly explain. Tesla was sent to investigate personally, a task that would carry far more consequence than anyone initially expected. At Strasbourg, Tesla traced the underlying fault with characteristic speed, finding a design flaw that earlier repair attempts had missed entirely. While completing the work, he found time in whatever hours local officials allowed him to construct a rough model of his induction motor, the same concept first glimpsed years earlier in a Budapest park. This was no longer a sketch scratched into dirt. It was a working demonstration of alternating current producing rotation without any commutator at all. He showed the model to local officials and to a few visiting dignitaries, hoping someone with capital might grasp its significance immediately. Almost no one did. European investors remained deeply committed to direct current, and Tesla's concept struck most observers as an interesting curiosity rather than a serious commercial opportunity. He returned to Paris frustrated, carrying proof that his idea worked while finding almost nobody willing to fund it further. Back in the city, Tesla resumed his regular duties while quietly nursing disappointment over the motor's cool reception. It was during this stretch that he came into closer contact with Charles Batchelor, a senior manager within Continental Edison and one of Thomas Edison's most trusted associates. Batchelor recognized something unusual in Tesla almost immediately, an intensity of focus that stood out even among skilled colleagues. Mutual respect for precise, well-executed work grew steadily between them. Company politics complicated matters throughout this same period, as financial restructuring within Continental Edison's European branch created growing friction among engineers. Promised raises and promotions were delayed or quietly withdrawn, leaving capable employees feeling undervalued. Tesla, never especially skilled at hiding frustration, grew increasingly restless within the organization. He had, by this point, spent roughly 2 years proving his abilities repeatedly, from Strasbourg's power plant to countless smaller repairs across the region. Advancement, despite this record, seemed permanently out of reach. Batchelor watched this mounting dissatisfaction and began quietly considering an alternative path for the young engineer he had come to respect. Edison's American headquarters, expanding rapidly under his direct supervision, was constantly searching for skilled engineering talent willing to relocate. Batchelor believed Tesla could thrive there and perhaps even catch Edison's personal attention, given the right introduction. The idea took shape gradually rather than arriving as a single decision. Eventually, Batchelor acted on it directly, drafting a letter addressed to Thomas Edison himself. He recommended Tesla in terms that history has repeated often since, describing him as one of the most capable engineers Batchelor had personally known. The letter reportedly characterized Tesla, in a phrase quoted many times afterward, as one of two great men, with Edison himself implied as the other. Whether Batchelor intended the comparison quite so grandly remains debated among historians who have studied the letter's exact wording over the years. What is certain is that the recommendation carried genuine weight, coming from someone Edison trusted without hesitation. It gave Tesla a direct path to America's most famous inventor, something his technical brilliance alone had failed to secure in Europe. Tesla had grown increasingly convinced that Europe simply lacked the capital and appetite for risk his ideas required to move past mere demonstration. America, by contrast, seemed to represent exactly the kind of restless, expanding environment where a bold new electrical system might finally find backers. He had no guarantee, of course, that Edison's organization would prove any more receptive to alternating current than European investors had been. Edison had built his considerable fortune on direct current, after all. Still, the chance to work directly within America's most significant electrical enterprise outweighed whatever ideological mismatch might eventually surface. Preparing for the journey required more than enthusiasm alone, and Tesla's finances heading into 1884 remained precarious. Accounts differ on exactly how much money he departed with, though most describe a remarkably small sum. Some versions of the story claim he was robbed shortly before departure, losing what little savings he had managed to set aside. Whatever the precise financial details, the picture that emerges consistently is one of a young engineer traveling toward enormous opportunity while carrying almost nothing tangible to fall back on. His real capital in the end amounted to little more than a letter and his own unshaken confidence in what he had already proven at Strasbourg. Leaving Paris meant leaving behind 2 years of hard-won credibility, built repair by repair, and diagnosis by diagnosis within the Continental Edison organization. It also meant leaving unresolved the induction motor demonstration that had failed to attract serious European backing, despite clearly working as designed. Tesla carried that unfinished business across the Atlantic, convinced America would eventually provide the audience Europe had refused to offer. The ocean crossing itself proved far from smooth, adding another layer of hardship to an already uncertain journey. Accounts describe rough seas and, at one point, near mutiny among the crew, circumstances that left Tesla arriving in New York thoroughly exhausted. He carried a handful of belongings, a few coins by most retellings, and Bachelor's carefully worded letter. It was hardly the arrival of a conquering figure, yet it carried within it everything he needed to begin again. Chapter 5: Crossing to Edison's America. New York in the summer of 1884 struck Tesla as a city running at an entirely different speed than anything he had known in Europe. Streets buzzed with construction, commerce, and a restless ambition matching his own private sense of urgency. He carried Bachelor's letter carefully through crowded avenues, uncertain how quickly he might secure an audience with the man it addressed. Manhattan then was still years from the skyline it would eventually become, yet it already felt vast and impatient. Reaching Edison's operation did not take long. The Edison Machine Works, located downtown, served as the practical engineering hub for Edison's growing electrical empire. Tesla presented Bachelor's letter directly, and by most accounts, Edison read it with genuine interest rather than polite indifference. Almost immediately, Tesla was offered work within the organization. Edison himself, by 1884, had already become something close to a folk hero, celebrated for the phonograph, the light bulb, and an entire direct current system built essentially from nothing. He worked with restless, hands-on energy, often laboring alongside his engineers late into the night. Tesla, accustomed to his own relentless work ethic, found something familiar in that intensity, even as their personalities differed sharply. Edison tested through trial and error. Tesla preferred building complete solutions inside his mind first. Tesla's earliest assignments involved troubleshooting the company's dynamos and motors, work well suited to his diagnostic talents from Strasbourg. He quickly distinguished himself, once again, as someone capable of solving problems that had stumped colleagues for weeks. Word of his abilities spread through the organization, and Edison himself reportedly took note. It seemed for a while like exactly the opportunity he had crossed an ocean to find. One particular challenge would define this early period more than any other. Edison, according to accounts Tesla gave and that historians still debate, offered him $50,000 if he could redesign the company's direct current dynamos, making them significantly more efficient. $50,000 in 1884 represented an enormous sum, far beyond what an ordinary engineer might earn across several years. Tesla accepted eagerly, seeing both financial opportunity and a chance to prove himself decisively. He worked through dozens of design modifications over the following months, testing new configurations for the dynamo's internal components. The improvements he delivered were genuinely significant, resulting in machines considerably more efficient than those previously in use. By any reasonable measure, he had fulfilled exactly what had been asked of him. When he approached Edison expecting payment, the response was starkly different from what he anticipated. Edison, according to Tesla, simply laughed off the promise, reportedly telling him he did not yet understand American humor. The implication was that the enormous sum had never been meant literally at all. Instead, Edison offered a modest raise, nowhere close to the amount that had motivated months of dedicated work. Tesla felt genuinely betrayed, viewing it as a breach of trust rather than a misunderstanding about humor. Edison, for his part, may have viewed the episode quite differently, believing the figure had always been understood as exaggerated motivation rather than a binding commitment. Financial promises, in Tesla's understanding, carried equal weight whether made formally or in passing conversation. Edison's casual dismissal suggested an entirely different set of assumptions. Neither man seemed willing to bridge that gap. This dispute marked a decisive turning point in Tesla's relationship with the organization. He felt his substantial contributions had been dismissed with what amounted to a joke, a response that struck him as deeply disrespectful. Edison's assumptions about informal promises clearly differed from Tesla's own. Tesla resigned from the Edison Machine Works shortly after, walking away from what had briefly seemed like his most promising American opportunity. The decision was not made lightly, given how recently he had arrived with almost nothing beyond bachelor's letter and his own talent. Colleagues later described the resignation as swift and final, with little room left for reconciliation once trust had broken down. Edison accepted it without significant protest, perhaps viewing Tesla as one talented engineer among many passing through his organization. Beyond the immediate financial dispute, a deeper philosophical divide had also been quietly widening between them. Edison's commercial empire rested entirely on direct current distribution, a system he had invested enormous resources building across New York. Tesla, still carrying his unresolved conviction about alternating current from Strasbourg, occasionally raised the subject during his employment. Edison showed little patience for these suggestions, having already committed his reputation to the opposite approach. This disagreement over electrical distribution's future would resurface later, far more publicly and consequentially, in the years immediately following Tesla's departure. Leaving Edison's employment left him in a genuinely precarious position within a country where he still had few established connections. He had crossed an ocean specifically to work within America's most significant electrical enterprise. Within roughly a year, he found himself unemployed and starting over. The $50,000 dispute had cost him not merely disappointed expectations, but also the institutional support that had briefly made his transition feel secure. Whatever bridges remained with Edison's organization had, by this point, been thoroughly burned. He would need an entirely different path forward, one that did not depend on Edison's goodwill or his commitment to an aging technology. What Tesla carried away from this bruising experience, beyond simple resentment, was a clarified sense of his own worth. He had proven decisively that he could deliver genuine engineering results under real commercial pressure. The failure to receive fair compensation stung deeply, yet it did not shake his underlying confidence. If anything, the experience hardened his determination to build something of his own. The months immediately following his resignation proved genuinely difficult, testing his resolve in ways even Graz and Budapest had not quite matched. Without steady employment or institutional credibility, he found himself increasingly isolated within a city that had initially seemed to offer such clear opportunity. Word of the Edison dispute may well have circulated among other potential employers. Fresh opportunities grew harder to secure than they might otherwise have been. Whatever combination of circumstances was responsible, Tesla soon faced hardship considerably more immediate and physical than anything his earlier setbacks had required. That hardship and the unlikely path it eventually opened would define the very next stage of his American story. Chapter 6: Digging Ditches, Founding a Company. The winter following his resignation from the Edison Machine Works tested Tesla in ways no professor's dismissal or foreign breakdown ever had. Without steady income, he struggled simply to cover rent and meals. New York, so full of promise on his arrival, now felt considerably less forgiving. Some accounts describe him accepting whatever manual labor he could find that winter, including a stretch of time spent digging ditches for a construction crew. It was a bitter irony, an engineer trained across 3 countries reduced to manual excavation for wages that barely covered survival. He later described the period with a mixture of dark humor and real bitterness. His education, he said, seemed to count for very little against the plain demand of putting food on the table. Pride becomes a luxury in circumstances that desperate. The physical work itself was exhausting. Long hours, difficult conditions, and pay that offered little beyond bare subsistence wore at him steadily. Tesla, who had once solved calculations faster than classmates could manage with pencil and paper, now spent his days moving earth beside men with no technical training at all. He endured it quietly, waiting for something to shift. Something eventually did, through a connection almost too fitting to be coincidence. The foreman overseeing his crew happened to know people in the local electrical contracting trade. Recognizing that this particular laborer spoke and reasoned like no ordinary ditch digger, he mentioned Tesla to a contact of his. That mention traveled further than either man could have predicted. It reached Alfred S. Brown, a manager with the Western Union Telegraph Company, who had both genuine curiosity about emerging electrical technology and real access to investment capital. Brown arranged to meet Tesla directly, curious whether the stories about him held any truth. The meeting went well. Tesla, given an actual audience for once, described his ideas about alternating current and the induction motor with the same conviction that had once startled a Budapest schoolyard. Brown was intrigued enough to bring in a second man, Charles F. Peck, a lawyer with a talent for structuring new business ventures and securing financial backing. Peck listened to Tesla's explanations with a lawyer's practical skepticism, asking pointed questions about patents, timelines, and commercial viability. Tesla answered patiently, aware that this conversation mattered more than almost any he had had in America so far. By its end, both men were convinced there was something worth funding here. Together, Brown and Peck proposed forming a company built specifically around Tesla's inventions, with himself as the technical mind and the two of them managing the business and financial structure. Tesla agreed readily, having learned the hard way from his experience with Edison exactly how badly he needed formal backing and legal protection this time. The arrangement gave him a laboratory, modest funding, and crucially, a path toward patenting his ideas properly. In April of 1887, the Tesla Electric Company was formally established in New York. The new laboratory, however modest compared to Edison's sprawling operations, represented an enormous change in Tesla's circumstances. For the first time since arriving in America, he had dedicated space, equipment, and financial support to pursue his own ideas rather than someone else's assigned projects. He set to work immediately, translating years of mental refinement into physical prototypes. The rotating magnetic field concept, first glimpsed in a Budapest park nearly 6 years earlier, was finally about to become tangible machinery. Tesla worked with an intensity that colleagues found remarkable, even by his own demanding standards. Within a matter of months, he had built functioning demonstrations of induction motors, along with related devices for generating and transmitting alternating current. Brown and Peck, watching this rapid progress, understood they needed to move quickly to secure patent protection before competitors could claim similar ground. Speed mattered enormously in an industry evolving as fast as electrical engineering was in the late 1880s. Throughout 1887 and into 1888, Tesla filed a remarkable series of patents covering nearly every essential component of a complete alternating current system. These included patents for induction motors, transformers, generators, and the broader distribution architecture needed to make the whole system commercially viable. Few inventors in history have produced such a comprehensive, interlocking body of foundational patents within so short a span. It was, in effect, an entire electrical infrastructure captured on paper before most of the world even understood what alternating current could do. Word of these patents began circulating through engineering circles, drawing attention from people who immediately grasped their commercial significance. Among those paying close attention was George Westinghouse, an inventor and industrialist already building his own electrical enterprise centered in Pittsburgh. Westinghouse had spent years searching for a viable alternating current system to compete against Edison's dominant direct current network. Tesla's patents, appearing seemingly all at once, looked like exactly what he had been waiting for. Brown and Peck, sensing the magnitude of interest building around Tesla's work, began the delicate process of negotiating with Westinghouse's representatives. The stakes were considerable, and neither side wanted to move carelessly given how much money and technological advantage hung in the balance. Meetings stretched across weeks, with Tesla occasionally traveling to demonstrate his motors and generators directly for Westinghouse's engineers. Every demonstration only strengthened the case that this technology represented something genuinely transformative. By 1888, the negotiations concluded with an agreement that would alter the course of Tesla's career and the entire electrical industry. Westinghouse purchased the rights to Tesla's alternating current patents, along with securing Tesla's ongoing consultation for a combination of cash payment, stock, and royalties tied to future use of the system. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary reversal of fortune. Less than 2 years after digging ditches for survival wages, Tesla now held a licensing arrangement with one of America's most ambitious industrialists. The agreement did more than simply enrich Tesla financially, though it did that too, finally granting him a measure of security he had not known since leaving Europe. It also placed his alternating current system directly into competition with Edison's entrenched direct current network, setting the stage for a conflict that would soon become public, bitter, and remarkably personal. Edison, watching a former employee's technology now backed by a serious industrial rival, had every reason to view the development with alarm. What began as a quiet licensing deal between Tesla and Westinghouse was about to erupt into one of the most consequential industrial rivalries of the century. Chapter 7: The War of Currents begins. By 1888, the Westinghouse Electric Company had acquired everything it needed to launch a genuine challenge to Edison's dominance. Tesla's patents provided the technical foundation, covering motors, generators, and transformers essential to a complete alternating current system. George Westinghouse himself brought considerable industrial resources and a fighter's temperament to the effort. Together, these elements set the stage for a confrontation that would soon reach far beyond ordinary business competition. Edison, watching this challenge take shape, faced a genuine threat to the empire he had spent years building around direct current. His entire distribution network depended on power stations placed every mile or so, since direct current could not travel efficiently across longer distances without severe energy loss. Alternating current suffered no such limitation, capable of traveling many miles through transformers that stepped voltage up for transmission and back down for safe household use. This single technical advantage threatened to make Edison's carefully constructed infrastructure obsolete within a matter of years. Rather than simply competing on technical merit or price, Edison chose a different strategy entirely, one built around fear rather than engineering. He began a public campaign designed to convince ordinary Americans that alternating current was inherently dangerous, far more so than the direct current his own company distributed. High voltage, he argued repeatedly to reporters and audiences, posed a lethal hazard that alternating current's transmission method made unavoidable. It was, in some technical sense, not entirely dishonest. It was, however, calculated far more toward public alarm than toward genuine safety education. The campaign escalated well beyond speeches and newspaper interviews. Edison and his associates began staging public demonstrations in which animals, mostly stray dogs and cats, were electrocuted using alternating current supplied by Westinghouse equipment. These demonstrations were designed explicitly to horrify onlookers and to associate Tesla and Westinghouse's system with death in the public imagination. Harold Brown, an engineer sympathetic to Edison's cause, conducted many of these events personally, framing each one as proof of alternating current's inherent danger. Tesla found these tactics genuinely repugnant, viewing them as scientifically dishonest and morally indefensible, regardless of whatever competitive advantage they might secure. He understood, better than almost anyone involved in the dispute, that any electrical current delivered at sufficiently high voltage could prove lethal, direct, or alternating alike. The demonstrations obscured this basic fact deliberately, exploiting public unfamiliarity with electrical principles to score a commercial point. Westinghouse, for his part, pushed back publicly wherever he could, though counteracting fear-based spectacle with technical argument proved a difficult, uneven fight. The rivalry reached its darkest point when Edison's associates became involved in promoting the use of alternating current for a newly proposed method of capital punishment. New York State, seeking an alternative to hanging, had begun exploring electrocution as a supposedly more humane execution method. Harold Brown and others aligned with Edison lobbied intensely for Westinghouse's alternating current equipment to be used specifically in this application, hoping the association with execution would permanently damage the technology's public reputation. Westinghouse fought this effort with real determination, refusing to sell equipment directly for the purpose and attempting through legal and public channels to prevent alternating current from becoming forever linked with the electric chair. His efforts ultimately failed. In 1890, William Kemmler became the first person executed by electrocution, using a generator that had been obtained indirectly despite Westinghouse's resistance. The execution itself was reportedly botched badly, prolonged and gruesome in ways that horrified witnesses rather than reassuring the public of the method's promised humanness. Edison's camp had hoped the association between alternating current and this new execution method would settle the entire competition in direct current's favor almost immediately. The public reaction proved more complicated than anticipated, however, with considerable horror directed at the execution's brutality rather than exclusively at the current type involved. Some newspapers began referring to electrocution informally using Westinghouse's name, a coinage Westinghouse himself found deeply offensive given his active efforts to prevent the association entirely. The propaganda war, in other words, produced consequences that neither side fully controlled once set into motion. Throughout this bruising public campaign, Tesla focused his own energy primarily on continued technical development rather than direct public combat with Edison. He believed, with characteristic confidence, that alternating current's genuine engineering superiority would eventually prove decisive regardless of whatever fear campaigns Edison's camp managed to generate in the meantime. This was not naivety so much as a particular kind of stubbornness, a conviction that sound engineering ultimately outlasts clever marketing. History would eventually vindicate this belief, though not before considerable additional conflict played out across several more years. Westinghouse, meanwhile, bore the brunt of the financial and reputational battle far more directly than Tesla did personally. Building out an entirely new electrical distribution system required enormous capital investment, and Edison's fear campaign made potential customers and investors genuinely nervous about backing the technology. Westinghouse Electric faced real financial strain during this period, stretched thin by simultaneous need for capital investment and ongoing legal costs, defending against various patent challenges and public relations attacks. The company's survival during these years was never entirely guaranteed. Tesla's relationship with Westinghouse deepened considerably through this shared adversity, built on mutual respect that would eventually prove significant in ways neither man anticipated at the time. Westinghouse valued Tesla's technical genius immensely, while Tesla appreciated Westinghouse's genuine commitment to seeing alternating current succeed despite mounting pressure and cost. Their partnership, forged partly under this kind of external attack, developed into something closer to genuine friendship than a purely transactional business arrangement. That friendship would matter enormously during a looming financial crisis, still several years away. Public opinion, despite Edison's considerable efforts, gradually began shifting as more people gained direct experience with alternating current's practical benefits. Homes and businesses lit by Westinghouse's system found the service reliable and, contrary to Edison's warnings, no more dangerous in ordinary use than direct current had been. Word spread slowly but steadily through communities where alternating current installations proved themselves over months of uneventful, functional service. Fear campaigns, however dramatic, could not indefinitely outweigh consistent, positive lived experience. The scientific and engineering communities, too, increasingly recognized alternating current's clear technical advantages for large-scale power distribution, regardless of Edison's public rhetoric. Papers and presentations at engineering societies began treating the debate less as a live controversy and more as a settled question, tilting decisively toward Tesla's approach. Edison himself, though he would resist the conclusion for years afterward, faced growing internal pressure from his own company's investors, who recognized that continued resistance to alternating current risked leaving the entire Edison enterprise commercially stranded. The tide, slowly but unmistakably, was turning. Nothing would demonstrate that shift more dramatically than the opportunity now approaching on the horizon, a chance for alternating current to prove itself not through animal demonstrations or execution controversies, but through the kind of large-scale, publicly celebrated achievement that no amount of fear-based propaganda could easily undo. The World's Columbian Exposition, planned for Chicago in 1893, represented exactly this kind of stage. Whichever electrical system illuminated that fair would carry an unmistakable public endorsement, visible to millions of visitors from across the country and around the world. Tesla and Westinghouse, bruised but unbowed by years of bitter conflict, now turned their full attention toward winning that contract. Chapter 8: Niagara and the World's Fair. Chicago, in the early 1890s, was preparing for something unprecedented in American history. The city had won the right to host the World's Columbian Exposition, a fair commemorating 400 years since Columbus reached the Americas. Organizers wanted the exposition lit entirely by electricity on a scale no previous fair had attempted. Whoever won that contract would gain more than money. They would gain a public verdict in the ongoing current war. Both Edison's General Electric and Westinghouse Electric submitted competing bids to illuminate the fairgrounds. Edison's proposal relied on his established direct current system, backed by his company's long reputation. Westinghouse countered with a bid built around alternating current, promising lower cost and greater reliability at scale. The financial stakes alone made this a serious contest, but the symbolic stakes mattered even more. Westinghouse ultimately won the contract, submitting a bid significantly lower than General Electric's, thanks partly to alternating current's inherent efficiency advantages over longer distances. The victory stunned much of the electrical industry, still accustomed to viewing Edison's system as the default standard. For Tesla, it represented vindication years in the making. The technology dismissed by his own professor back in Graz was now set to light an entire World's Fair. Preparation for the exposition required enormous engineering effort under considerable time pressure. Westinghouse's team needed to design, manufacture, and install generators, transformers, and nearly 100,000 incandescent lamps across the fairgrounds. Tesla contributed directly to this effort, refining generator designs and troubleshooting technical challenges as they emerged. The scale of the undertaking dwarfed anything either man had previously attempted. When the exposition opened in May of 1893, the results exceeded even ambitious expectations. Visitors arriving after dark encountered a fairground bathed entirely in electric light, buildings outlined in glowing bulbs against the night sky. Many attendees had never seen anything like it, since electric lighting on this scale simply did not exist anywhere else in the country. Newspapers described the spectacle in near reverent terms, treating it as a genuine glimpse of the future. Tesla himself appeared at the fair, demonstrating additional inventions within the Westinghouse exhibition space. He showed early wireless lighting experiments, illuminating vacuum tubes without any direct wire connection, astonishing crowds unfamiliar with such phenomena. He also demonstrated devices related to his ongoing work in high-frequency currents, hinting at ambitions well beyond simple illumination. These exhibits cemented his public reputation as one of the era's most inventive minds. The commercial and reputational impact of the fair proved immediate and lasting. Alternating current, previously dismissed by much of the public as untested and dangerous, now carried the endorsement of a spectacle seen by millions of visitors. Edison's fear campaign, built over several bruising years, could not easily survive this kind of direct, joyful public experience. The current war, while not yet formally over, had clearly tilted in Westinghouse and Tesla's favor. Even before the fair's success fully settled, an even larger opportunity was already taking shape. Niagara Falls, long recognized as an extraordinary source of potential power, had become the focus of an ambitious engineering project. A commission had been formed years earlier to determine how the fall's energy might be harnessed and transmitted to nearby cities. The question of which electrical system would be used remained, for a time, genuinely unsettled. Competing proposals arrived from multiple companies, each hoping to secure the enormously prestigious contract. Direct current advocates argued for their established system, while alternating current proponents pointed toward its demonstrated efficiency at the Chicago Fair. The commission deliberated carefully, aware that whatever decision they reached would likely define the future direction of American power generation. Tesla's patents, licensed through Westinghouse, ultimately proved decisive. In 1893, the same year as the triumphant Chicago Exposition, the Niagara Falls Power Company awarded its contract to Westinghouse Electric. The decision represented an enormous validation of Tesla's alternating current system, chosen now for one of the largest engineering projects in the nation's history. Construction began soon afterward, involving massive generators designed specifically to harness the fall's tremendous natural force. The scale of ambition here exceeded even the Chicago Exposition considerably. Engineers faced substantial technical challenges throughout construction, adapting Tesla's patented designs to machinery capable of handling the fall's immense power output. Generators needed to be built at a scale rarely attempted before, converting the raw mechanical force of falling water into reliable alternating current. Transmission lines needed to carry that power efficiently toward Buffalo, a city roughly 20 miles distant from the falls themselves. Every stage of the project tested engineering knowledge at its practical limits. By 1895, the Niagara Falls Power Station began operating successfully, transmitting electricity across the required distance without the severe losses that would have doomed a direct current equivalent. Buffalo's streets and businesses soon received power generated entirely from the falls, a demonstration of long-distance transmission that direct current simply could not have matched. The achievement drew international attention, with engineers and journalists from multiple countries traveling to witness the station directly. It stood, by most informed assessments, as definitive proof of alternating current's practical superiority. For Tesla personally, the Niagara project represented something close to the fulfillment of everything he had first glimpsed walking through a Budapest park more than a decade earlier. The rotating magnetic field concept, dismissed once as barely more plausible than perpetual motion, now powered an entire American city from a natural wonder many considered impossible to harness commercially. His patents had provided the essential foundation for both the Chicago Exposition and the Niagara Station, two of the most celebrated engineering achievements of the era. Few inventors experience such direct, visible confirmation of their life's central idea within their own lifetime. The current war, for all practical purposes, had reached its conclusion by the mid-1890s. Alternating current success at Niagara, following so closely behind its triumphant debut in Chicago, left little room for continued serious debate about which system represented the future. Edison's own company would eventually adopt alternating current technology as well, a quiet but unmistakable concession to the argument he had fought so hard against for years. Tesla, meanwhile, stood at the peak of his public recognition, his name now closely associated with electrification itself. Yet even as this chapter of triumph closed, Tesla's ambitions had already begun stretching towards something considerably stranger and more difficult. Wireless transmission, hinted at through his fair demonstrations, occupied an increasingly central place in his thinking. Niagara had proven that power could travel efficiently across ordinary distances through wires. Tesla now wondered whether power, and even information itself, might someday travel without any wires at all. That question would soon carry him toward the high plains of Colorado and toward experiments considerably more ambitious than anything he had yet attempted. Chapter 9: Colorado Springs. By the late 1890s, Tesla had grown restless with New York's limitations for the kind of experiments he now wanted to run. His laboratory on Houston Street had recently burned in a fire that destroyed years of notes, models, and equipment, a devastating setback that nonetheless freed him to think about starting somewhere entirely new. He wanted space, altitude, and dry air, conditions suited to generating and studying extremely high voltages. Colorado Springs, sitting at considerable elevation with thin atmosphere and frequent thunderstorms, seemed almost designed for his purposes. In the spring of 1899, he relocated west to begin this next phase of work. Local backing helped make the move possible, particularly support from a Colorado Springs businessman willing to provide land and some financial assistance for the venture. Tesla built a modest but purpose-built laboratory on the outskirts of town, isolated enough to avoid interfering with the city's own electrical systems. Word spread quickly among locals that something unusual was happening at the strange wooden building with its tall mast rising from the roof. Curiosity mixed with genuine unease as residents watched construction proceed through the early months of that year. At the center of the laboratory stood an enormous Tesla coil, considerably larger than anything he had previously constructed. This device could generate extraordinarily high voltages, producing artificial lightning bolts that stretched many feet from the coil's terminal. Tesla intended to use it for studying the behavior of high-frequency, high-voltage electricity under conditions no laboratory had previously attempted to recreate at this scale. The ambition here extended well beyond simple demonstration. Nighttime tests produced spectacular results that local residents could hardly help but notice. Massive sparks crackled from the laboratory's mast, sometimes visible for considerable distances across the surrounding plains. Thunder-like cracks accompanied these discharges, loud enough that nearby residents reported windows rattling in their homes. Some accounts describe horses becoming startled by the noise, and grass near the laboratory reportedly showing scorch marks after particularly intense tests. Tesla pursued several distinct lines of research during his months in Colorado Springs, not simply generating impressive sparks for their own sake. He studied the Earth's own electrical properties, exploring whether the planet itself might function as a conductor capable of carrying electrical signals across vast distances. He also investigated atmospheric electricity more broadly, hoping to better understand phenomena like lightning through direct observation and measurement. These investigations fed directly into his growing ambition to transmit both power and information wirelessly across the globe. One particular episode from this period became especially famous and especially controversial in later retellings of Tesla's career. Using specially designed receiving equipment, Tesla reported detecting what he described as regular, patterned electrical signals arriving from an unknown source. He speculated, publicly and with evident seriousness, that these signals might originate from intelligent life elsewhere, possibly even from Mars. The claim generated enormous press attention, mixing genuine scientific curiosity with considerable skepticism from other scientists. Most researchers who examined Tesla's claims at the time, and virtually all who have studied them since, concluded the signals were far more likely the result of natural electromagnetic phenomena rather than extraterrestrial communication. Atmospheric disturbances, distant lightning activity, or even interference from his own powerful equipment offered more plausible explanations. Tesla, however, never fully retracted his interpretation, continuing to reference the possibility of intelligent signals in later writings and interviews. The episode did lasting damage to his reputation among more conservative scientific colleagues, even as it added to his growing public mystique. Beyond these headline-grabbing claims, Tesla's Colorado Springs experiments produced genuinely significant technical data about high-voltage phenomena. He measured and documented behaviors of electrical discharge that had never been systematically studied at this scale before. His notebooks from this period, later examined closely by historians and engineers, reveal careful, methodical observation alongside the more speculative claims that drew public attention. The work here laid groundwork he would later apply to his wireless transmission ambitions. Funding, however, remained a persistent and worsening concern throughout his time in Colorado. The businessman who had initially supported the venture grew increasingly uneasy about costs that continued climbing without any clear commercial product emerging from the research. Tesla characteristically viewed the work as foundational science that would eventually yield enormous practical value, a perspective his backer found harder to sustain as bills accumulated. Tension between scientific ambition and financial reality would recur throughout the remainder of Tesla's career, and Colorado Springs offered an early preview of that pattern. Matters came to a head when Tesla's experiments began interfering directly with the local power company's own equipment and service. His massive coil, drawing enormous amounts of current for its demonstrations, reportedly overloaded circuits and disrupted electrical service for the surrounding area on more than one occasion. In one particularly dramatic account, Tesla's testing is said to have burned out a generator belonging to the Colorado Springs Electric Company, leaving portions of the town without power. The company was understandably furious about the damage and disruption. Tesla eventually repaired or compensated for the damaged equipment, though accounts vary regarding the precise details and the extent of ill will that lingered afterward. The incident nonetheless illustrated something important about the sheer scale of power his experiments now involved, well beyond anything a typical laboratory might draw from local utilities. It also underscored the practical risks of conducting research this ambitious in a small city not equipped to absorb such demands without disruption. Relations with local officials and utility operators grew noticeably more strained as a result. By early 1900, Tesla's funding situation had become genuinely untenable, and the Colorado Springs venture drew toward its natural conclusion. He had gathered substantial data and formed increasingly ambitious theories about wireless transmission of both energy and information across the globe. What he lacked was the enormous capital such an undertaking would require to move from laboratory experiment toward practical, large-scale application. Returning east, he began searching for backers capable of funding an ambition considerably larger than anything he had yet attempted. The months in Colorado had changed Tesla in ways that extended beyond the specific data he collected there. He returned east convinced, more firmly than ever, that the Earth itself could serve as a medium for transmitting electrical signals across any distance without wires. This conviction, equal parts brilliant insight and unproven speculation, would soon drive him toward his most audacious project yet. Financial backing on the scale required would need to come from someone operating in an entirely different league than the local businessman who had supported his Colorado work. That search would soon lead him to one of the wealthiest and most powerful financiers in the country. Chapter 10: Wardenclyffe Rising. Tesla returned to New York in 1900, carrying an idea considerably larger than anything he had previously attempted to fund. He envisioned a global system capable of transmitting both electrical power and information wirelessly, using the Earth itself as a conductor. This was not simply an improved radio transmitter in his own mind. It was a complete reimagining of how energy and communication might move across the entire planet. Securing funding at this scale required someone operating in a different financial universe than his previous backers. Tesla approached J. Pierpont Morgan, among the most powerful financiers in the country, whose capital had shaped railroads, steel, and much of American industry. Morgan initially showed interest, though the two men understood the proposal rather differently from the outset. Tesla spoke expansively of worldwide wireless communication and power transmission. Morgan, more practically minded, saw an opportunity primarily in wireless telegraphy, a commercially obvious application competing directly against Marconi's growing radio business. In 1900, Morgan agreed to invest a substantial sum, roughly $150,000, in exchange for a share of Tesla's future patents. The agreement gave Tesla the capital he needed to begin construction on Long Island, at a site that would become known as Wardenclyffe. Tesla, characteristically, understood the deal as backing for his grander wireless vision. Morgan, just as characteristically, understood it as an investment in a competitive telegraph enterprise. This mismatch in expectations would eventually prove costly. Construction began in earnest on a large tower designed by architect Stanford White, a respected figure already known for prominent buildings across New York. The structure rose nearly 200 feet, topped with a large metal dome intended to broadcast Tesla's signals across vast distances. Beneath the tower, extensive underground works extended deep into the earth, part of Tesla's plan to use the planet itself as a conductive medium. The scale and ambition of the project drew considerable curiosity from observers who struggled to understand exactly what it was meant to accomplish. Tesla worked at Wardenclyffe with characteristic intensity, overseeing construction while simultaneously refining the theoretical foundations underlying the entire system. He believed the completed tower could transmit not just messages, but usable electrical power itself, available anywhere on Earth without wires of any kind. Ships at sea might receive navigation signals. Remote regions with no existing infrastructure might draw power directly from the atmosphere itself. It was, by any measure, one of the most audacious engineering visions of the era. Costs, however, climbed considerably faster than Tesla had anticipated when negotiating with Morgan. Construction expenses, equipment purchases, and ongoing experimentation consumed the initial investment more quickly than the project's timeline allowed for. Tesla returned to Morgan repeatedly requesting additional funds, each time expanding on the grand vision of global wireless power that had never been the financier's primary interest. Morgan grew increasingly skeptical of these requests, uncertain whether the project would ever produce anything resembling a return on his considerable investment. Meanwhile, a development occurring an ocean away would soon complicate Tesla's position dramatically. Guglielmo Marconi, an Italian inventor working on wireless telegraphy using principles that overlapped substantially with some of Tesla's own patented work, was racing toward a historic achievement of his own. Marconi sought to demonstrate that radio signals could cross the entire Atlantic Ocean, a feat many scientists considered technically impossible given the Earth's curvature and existing understanding of radio wave behavior. Success would establish him, rather than Tesla, as wireless communications' most celebrated pioneer. Tesla, watching Marconi's progress from Wardenclyffe, felt growing unease about a rival closing in on ground he considered fundamentally his own. Several of the components Marconi used in his transmitting and receiving equipment closely resembled devices Tesla had patented years earlier. Tesla believed, with justification that later legal proceedings would eventually confirm, that Marconi's system depended on his own foundational patents. For the moment, though, patent disputes mattered less than the pace of public achievement, and Marconi was moving fast. In December of 1901, Marconi successfully transmitted a radio signal across the Atlantic from Cornwall in England to Newfoundland in Canada. The achievement stunned the scientific world and captured public imagination in a way that overshadowed Tesla's still unfinished tower almost immediately. Newspapers celebrated Marconi as the man who had conquered wireless communication across the ocean. Tesla, whose own ambitions extended considerably beyond mere transatlantic messaging, found himself suddenly cast as a step behind rather than years ahead. The timing could hardly have been worse for Tesla's relationship with Morgan. Marconi's success suggested, at least to casual observers and to skeptical investors, that the commercially valuable application of wireless technology had already been achieved by someone else entirely. Morgan, who had invested specifically hoping for a competitive advantage in exactly this kind of transatlantic communication, now saw his rationale for continued funding evaporating rapidly. Tesla's pleas for additional capital, framed around a much larger vision Morgan had never fully embraced, fell on increasingly unreceptive ears. Tesla attempted repeatedly to explain that his own project aimed at something considerably more ambitious than Marconi's achievement, involving global power transmission rather than simple messaging. He argued that Wardenclyffe, once completed, would render Marconi's accomplishment relatively modest by comparison. Morgan, however, had grown weary of expanding promises that never seemed to arrive at a finished, commercially viable product. Correspondence between the two men during this period reveals mounting frustration on both sides, each feeling increasingly misunderstood by the other. By 1903 and into 1904, Morgan's financial support had effectively ceased, leaving Tesla without the capital needed to complete Wardenclyffe as originally envisioned. Construction slowed dramatically, and eventually stopped altogether, leaving the tower standing incomplete against the Long Island sky. Tesla continued searching desperately for alternative investors, writing to numerous wealthy individuals and companies in hopes of reviving the project. None proved willing to commit funds on the scale that Wardenclyffe's ambitions demanded. The unfinished tower became, over the following years, an increasingly visible symbol of Tesla's overreach in the eyes of skeptical observers. What had once represented perhaps the most ambitious wireless project ever attempted now sat abandoned, its promise unrealized and its costs unrecovered. Tesla himself refused for years to fully abandon hope that funding might eventually materialize to complete the vision. That hope, however, would prove increasingly difficult to sustain as his broader financial circumstances continued deteriorating throughout the following decade. Chapter 11: Marconi and the Collapse. By the middle of the decade's first years, Tesla found himself watching from a distance as Marconi's reputation continued climbing well beyond that first transatlantic success. Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company expanded steadily, securing contracts with shipping lines, governments, and news organizations eager for reliable long-distance communication. Each new success further cemented Marconi's public image as wireless technology's defining figure. Tesla, meanwhile, remained largely associated with an unfinished tower and a series of increasingly desperate funding appeals. The technical overlap between Marconi's system and Tesla's earlier patents continued to trouble Tesla deeply throughout this period. He believed firmly that key components of Marconi's transmitting apparatus depended on principles he had patented years before Marconi's own experiments began. Numerous scientists and engineers privately agreed that the resemblance was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Tesla, lacking the financial resources for sustained legal action, could do little beyond voicing his frustration in occasional public statements and private correspondence. Wardenclyffe itself sat increasingly derelict as these years passed, its unfinished tower a visible monument to ambitions that had outpaced available funding. Tesla continued paying what property taxes and maintenance costs he could manage, hoping against increasingly poor odds that new investment might eventually arrive. Visitors to the site described weeds growing thick around the base, equipment left exposed to weather, and an atmosphere of abandonment settling over what had once represented cutting-edge engineering ambition. The gap between Tesla's vision and the tower's physical reality grew starker with each passing season. Financial pressure mounted from multiple directions simultaneously during this stretch of Tesla's life. Debts accumulated from Wardenclyffe's construction remained unpaid, drawing persistent demands from creditors who had extended credit based on assurances of eventual project completion. Tesla's personal finances, never particularly well managed even during his more prosperous years, deteriorated steadily as income from his earlier patents proved insufficient to cover mounting obligations. He found himself increasingly negotiating with creditors rather than pursuing new scientific breakthroughs. George Westinghouse, Tesla's longtime business partner and friend, had provided crucial support during earlier difficult periods, including a notable renegotiation of royalty terms years before that had likely saved Tesla from earlier financial ruin. By this point, however, Westinghouse himself faced considerable business pressures of his own, limiting how much additional assistance he could realistically offer. Tesla could no longer rely on that particular safety net with the same confidence he once had. The web of support that had sustained him through previous crises was thinning noticeably. Tesla's attempts to secure new financial backing for Wardenclyffe grew increasingly strained and, at times, somewhat erratic in tone. Letters to potential investors during this period sometimes mixed legitimate technical explanation with grander claims that strained credibility even among sympathetic readers. He wrote of transmitting not just power and messages, but potentially even images and complex data across the globe, ambitions that sounded, to skeptical financial minds, more like fantasy than viable engineering. The very expansiveness of his vision, once inspiring, now worked against him in rooms full of cautious investors. By 1905, it had become clear to Tesla and to those around him that Wardenclyffe would not be completed under any realistic funding scenario available to him. The project's central purpose, global wireless transmission of power and information, remained theoretically compelling to Tesla himself, but practically unfundable given Marconi's already established commercial success in simpler wireless telegraphy. Continuing to pour resources into an increasingly hopeless cause made less and less sense, even to Tesla's characteristically stubborn optimism. The tower stood unfinished as work on it effectively ceased. Creditors, growing impatient with unpaid debts tied directly to the property, eventually moved toward more serious action regarding Wardenclyffe itself. The land and structure had been used as collateral against loans taken to fund ongoing construction and operational costs. As Tesla's ability to service these debts collapsed further, the threat of losing the property entirely became increasingly real. This was not a distant, abstract possibility, but an approaching certainty that Tesla seemed unable to prevent through any means still available to him. In 1917, years after construction had effectively stopped, the Wardenclyffe Tower was finally demolished, torn down, and sold for scrap to help satisfy debts still owed against the property. The demolition brought a relatively small sum, nowhere close to what constructing the tower had originally cost. For Tesla, watching this happen from a distance, it represented the physical end of a project that had once carried his most expansive scientific ambitions. Whatever remained of the vision existed now only in his notebooks and in his own continued belief in its eventual validity. The broader implications of Wardenclyffe's failure extended well beyond simple financial loss for Tesla personally. His public reputation, already complicated by the Colorado Springs Mars signal controversy, suffered further as observers increasingly viewed him as a brilliant but impractical dreamer, someone whose grand ambitions consistently outpaced his ability to deliver finished, commercially viable products. This characterization, whether entirely fair or not, would follow him for the remainder of his career. Investors grew noticeably more hesitant to back his subsequent proposals, regardless of their technical merit. Marconi, by contrast, continued accumulating both commercial success and public honor throughout this same period, eventually receiving the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1909 for his contributions to wireless telegraphy. Tesla viewed this recognition with considerable bitterness, believing his own foundational contributions to the underlying technology had gone unacknowledged by comparison. Legal disputes over the relevant patents would continue for years afterward, moving slowly through courts even as Marconi's public reputation remained largely untouched by the ongoing litigation. Vindication, when it eventually arrived for Tesla regarding these patents, would come only after his death, too late to matter for his standing during these difficult years. Looking back at this period from any later vantage point, the collapse of Wardenclyffe marks a genuine turning point in Tesla's career and public standing. Before it, he had moved from triumph to triumph, however difficult the path, culminating in Niagara's spectacular success and widespread recognition as one of the era's defining inventors. After it, his career increasingly consisted of smaller projects, occasional legal battles, and a gradually diminishing public platform for the grand ambitions that had once defined him. The man who had once lit a World's Fair now struggled to fund even modest continuations of his research. Tesla himself never fully abandoned belief in the underlying vision that Wardenclyffe represented, continuing to reference wireless power transmission in various forms throughout his remaining decades. Whether this reflected genuine, unwavering scientific conviction or a more complicated inability to accept the practical failure of his life's most ambitious project remains a matter historians continue debating. What is certain is that the years immediately following Wardenclyffe's collapse pushed Tesla toward an increasingly narrow, defensive posture. Patent battles, dwindling finances, and a diminished public reputation would define much of what followed, as his once boundless ambitions gave way to a considerably harder, more constrained chapter of his life. Chapter 12: The Patent Wars. The years following Wardenclyffe's collapse pulled Tesla into a different kind of battle entirely, fought less with coils and generators and more with lawyers and court filings. Patent disputes had trailed him for years, but they now consumed a disproportionate share of his time and dwindling resources. The most significant of these disputes concerned the very foundation of radio itself, a technology whose true authorship remained legally unsettled. Tesla believed the answer was obvious. Courts, unfortunately, moved at a pace that obviousness alone could not accelerate. At the center of the conflict sat Tesla's 1897 patent, covering key components of wireless transmission, technology he argued had been used, without proper credit or licensing, in Marconi's own systems. The Marconi company had grown into a major commercial enterprise by this point, its wireless telegraphy services indispensable to shipping and military communication alike. Challenging such an entrenched interest required resources Tesla simply no longer possessed in abundance. Still, he pursued the matter, convinced that legal vindication was only a matter of time and persistence. The legal proceedings dragged on for years, moving through various courts and appeals with the kind of grinding slowness particular to patent litigation. Tesla found himself testifying, submitting documents, and consulting with attorneys during stretches of time he might once have devoted entirely to new invention. Costs accumulated steadily, adding further strain to finances already stretched thin by Wardenclyffe's failure. Each delay chipped away a little more at whatever optimism he still carried into these proceedings. Adding further complication, The United States Marconi Company itself became entangled in a separate patent dispute with the federal government, a case that would eventually intersect with Tesla's own claims in unexpected ways. The government, needing to use certain wireless technologies during the First World War without becoming liable for patent infringement, found itself navigating a tangle of competing claims. Tesla's earlier patents sat somewhere within that tangle, relevant but not yet formally recognized as foundational. Untangling the mess would take considerably longer than the war itself lasted. Beyond the courtroom, Tesla's daily life during this period reflected a marked retreat from the grand industrial ambitions that had once defined him. He worked on smaller inventions and consulting projects, none carrying anything close to the scale or public attention of Niagara or Wardenclyffe. Financial necessity, rather than pure scientific curiosity, increasingly drove which projects he chose to pursue. It was a considerable calm down for a man who had once negotiated directly with the era's most powerful financier. Tesla did continue inventing throughout these years, even if the results attracted less fanfare than his earlier work. He developed ideas related to turbines, exploring bladeless designs that operated on different mechanical principles than conventional turbine technology. He pursued various concepts in remote control and robotics as well, building on demonstrations he had given years earlier involving a radio-controlled boat. None of these ventures, however promising in theory, achieved the commercial success his earlier alternating current work had delivered. His reputation within scientific circles remained genuinely respected despite the mounting financial difficulties surrounding him. Colleagues and engineers continued to acknowledge the depth and originality of his earlier contributions, even as some grew skeptical of his more expansive later claims. This created an odd duality in how the public and the scientific community viewed him, respected as a genuine pioneer while simultaneously regarded with growing weariness as an eccentric prone to grandiose promises. Both perceptions, in their own ways, were accurate. Money troubles during this period grew serious enough that Tesla struggled at times simply to maintain his living situation. He moved between hotels with some regularity, occasionally leaving unpaid bills behind him as he relocated to new accommodations. This pattern would continue and even worsen in subsequent years, becoming a defining feature of his later life. The scientist who had once negotiated deals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars now found himself negotiating instead with hotel managers over overdue rent. Despite these hardships, Tesla maintained an active public presence through interviews, occasional lectures, and continued correspondence with scientific institutions. Journalists remained interested in him, drawn by his colorful personality and his willingness to speculate expansively about future technologies. He discussed ideas ranging from wireless power to death rays to devices for detecting enemy submarines, mixing genuine scientific insight with speculation that sometimes outpaced what he could actually demonstrate. This blend of credibility and showmanship kept him in public conversation even as his practical influence waned. The patent litigation over radio's origins would not reach any meaningful resolution during these particular years, dragging on well beyond the time frame covered in this chapter of his life. Tesla continued believing with unwavering conviction that history would eventually credit him properly for radio's foundational principles. That belief would prove correct, though its vindication would arrive only after circumstances that Tesla himself could not have anticipated. For now, though, the courts offered him little beyond continued waiting and continued expense. Westinghouse's death in 1914 marked the loss of one of Tesla's most important remaining allies from his earlier years of triumph. Their relationship, forged through shared adversity during the current war and cemented through Westinghouse's crucial renegotiation of Tesla's royalty contract years earlier, had represented one of the more stable professional bonds in Tesla's often turbulent career. With Westinghouse gone, another piece of the support structure that had once surrounded Tesla's ambitions disappeared. He faced the coming years with fewer allies and considerably diminished resources. By the war's end in 1918, Tesla found himself a genuinely different figure than the confident inventor who had once stood at Niagara Falls celebrating alternating currents' triumph. He remained brilliant, undoubtedly, and remained capable of original technical thinking across multiple fields. What he lacked now was the institutional backing, the financial stability, and increasingly the public standing that had once made his grandest visions seem achievable rather than merely fascinating. The stage was set for an even more difficult period still to come, one defined less by dramatic legal battles and more by quiet, persistent decline. Chapter 13: The Hotel Years. By the early 1920s, Tesla had settled into a pattern of living that would define much of his remaining life. He moved between New York hotels, favoring establishments that offered a degree of dignity even as his ability to pay consistently for that dignity grew increasingly uncertain. The Waldorf Astoria became one of his more frequent residences, a place whose elegance suited his own carefully maintained sense of personal refinement. He dressed impeccably regardless of his financial circumstances, a habit that struck those who knew his real situation as both admirable and slightly heartbreaking. Hotel management at these establishments often extended considerable patience toward Tesla, aware of his reputation and perhaps hopeful that his fortunes might eventually improve. Unpaid bills accumulated at more than one location, sometimes for months at a stretch, before matters came to enough of a head that he needed to relocate. This pattern repeated itself with a kind of weary regularity throughout the decade. Tesla treated each move with outward composure, rarely acknowledging directly the financial distress that necessitated it. Despite these hardships, Tesla maintained genuine friendships and correspondences that offered him both intellectual companionship and occasional practical support. Robert Underwood Johnson, an editor and poet, along with his wife Catherine, had known Tesla for decades by this point, their friendship stretching back to some of his earlier years of prominence. The Johnsons hosted him regularly, providing not just meals and conversation, but a kind of social anchor during years when much else in his life felt increasingly unmoored. Catherine, in particular, maintained a warm and attentive correspondence with him across many years. Tesla's relationship with the Johnsons occasionally invited speculation among biographers regarding its precise emotional nature, given the evident closeness and affection visible in surviving letters. Whatever the true depth of feeling involved, the friendship appears to have remained fundamentally platonic and enduring, rather than romantic in any conventional sense. Robert Johnson valued Tesla's intellect and treated him as a genuine peer within New York's literary and scientific circles. For a man increasingly isolated by financial difficulty, this steady friendship mattered enormously. Mark Twain represented another significant friendship from Tesla's earlier, more prosperous years, one that had left a lasting impression despite Twain's death back in 1910. The two men had bonded over shared interests in both science and storytelling, with Twain reportedly finding genuine delight in visiting Tesla's laboratory to witness demonstrations firsthand. Tesla, for his part, admired Twain's wit and treated their friendship as one of the more genuinely enjoyable relationships of his adult life. Though gone by this point in the story, Twain's memory remained one Tesla referenced warmly in later interviews and writings. Financial support during these hotel years came from various sources, none entirely sufficient to resolve Tesla's underlying difficulties on a lasting basis. Occasional consulting fees, small licensing payments from earlier patents, and periodic assistance from friends and admirers kept him afloat without ever restoring genuine financial stability. Westinghouse Electric, honoring the earlier friendship between Tesla and its founder even after George Westinghouse's death, reportedly continued some manner of informal support during particularly difficult stretches. None of this amounted to security, however, only a kind of ongoing, precarious survival. Tesla's public image during this period grew increasingly complicated, blending genuine respect for his historical achievements with a certain condescending fascination toward his eccentricities and financial struggles. Newspapers occasionally ran features marking his birthday, treating him as something between a living legend and a curiosity worth checking in on periodically. He generally welcomed this attention, using birthday interviews as opportunities to discuss his ongoing theoretical interests and occasionally to speculate about future inventions still unrealized. These interviews became, over time, one of the more reliable ways the public continued to track his life. Life at the Waldorf Astoria and similar establishments also brought Tesla into regular contact with New York's broader social and intellectual circles, even as his personal fortunes declined. He attended occasional dinners and gatherings, maintaining the manners and bearing of the internationally respected figure he had once been more fully. Observers frequently commented on the contrast between his elegant, formal presentation and the financial precariousness that lay just beneath the surface of that presentation. Tesla seemed determined never to let one visibly undermine the other. Correspondence from this period reveals a man still intellectually active despite his circumstances, writing letters that ranged across topics from wireless power to cosmic rays to speculative future technologies. He maintained contact with various scientific institutions and occasionally submitted papers or proposals, though these generated considerably less traction than his earlier work had commanded. The gap between his continued theoretical ambition and his practical capacity to pursue it grew more pronounced with each passing year. Tesla, characteristically, seemed to experience this gap as frustrating rather than as any reason to lower his ambitions. Hotel relocations continued periodically throughout the decade, each move representing another quiet marker of his declining fortunes. The St. Regis, the Governor Clinton, and other Manhattan establishments each hosted him for periods before financial arrangements broke down sufficiently to necessitate another move. Tesla approached each transition with the same outward dignity, rarely complaining publicly about circumstances that would have humiliated many people considerably less proud than he was. His correspondence from these years shows occasional glimpses of the strain, though rarely stated in fully direct terms. Despite everything, Tesla's fundamental optimism about his own eventual vindication rarely wavered during these years, at least based on his public statements and private correspondence alike. He continued to believe that his contributions to radio, to wireless power, and to numerous other fields would eventually receive full and proper recognition. This conviction sustained him through financial hardship that might have broken a less stubbornly confident man. Whether this optimism reflected genuine insight into his eventual legacy or simply an unshakable personal temperament, it carried him steadily through some of the most difficult years of his life. The Johnsons, the memory of Twain, and a handful of other loyal friends and admirers provided something Tesla's finances increasingly could not: a sense of continued human connection and validation during years that might otherwise have felt overwhelmingly isolating. These relationships, quieter and less publicly celebrated than his earlier industrial triumphs, nonetheless sustained him through a decade defined more by quiet struggle than dramatic achievement. As the 1920s wore on, though, even these connections would need to compete increasingly with habits and behaviors growing more pronounced with age. Tesla's eccentricities, always present in some form, were beginning to deepen into something considerably more consuming. Chapter 14: Eccentricities and Isolation. By the late 1920s, certain habits that had always existed somewhere within Tesla's personality began asserting themselves with considerably more force. He had long shown particular sensitivities and preferences, but these now hardened into fixed, almost ritualistic patterns governing much of his daily life. Friends and hotel staff who interacted with him regularly noticed the shift gradually rather than all at once. What had once seemed like personal quirks increasingly resembled genuine compulsions. Cleanliness occupied a central place among these intensifying habits. Tesla insisted on an extraordinary number of clean towels and napkins during meals, sometimes requesting far more than any reasonable use would require. He avoided touching certain objects he considered contaminated, and he developed elaborate personal routines around washing and hygiene that struck observers as excessive even by the standards of a famously fastidious man. These behaviors consumed increasing amounts of his daily routine as the years progressed. Numbers, too, held a particular grip on his thinking that went well beyond ordinary mathematical interest. He reportedly preferred quantities divisible by 3, sometimes counting steps as he walked, or calculating the volume of items like soup or coffee before consuming them. Hotel staff who worked around him learned to accommodate these preferences, understanding them as simply part of accommodating a distinguished, if unusual, long-term guest. Tesla himself rarely explained the underlying logic to these numerical rituals, treating them instead as simply how he preferred to move through the world. Perhaps the most famous of his later life attachments involved pigeons, which he began feeding regularly in New York's parks, particularly around the New York Public Library and Bryant Park. What began as occasional feeding gradually became a near-daily ritual that Tesla treated with evident seriousness and devotion. He spent considerable sums, modest as his finances were, purchasing seeds specifically for this purpose. Some accounts describe him even building small feeding devices in his hotel rooms to accommodate injured birds he had rescued from the street. Tesla's attachment to these birds went beyond simple casual affection taking on an emotional significance that struck those around him as genuinely profound. He described in later interviews and writings a particular white pigeon that he claimed to love in a manner he compared to loving another person. This bird, he said, visited him regularly, and he devoted extraordinary attention to her well-being during the years of their acquaintance. When this pigeon eventually died, Tesla described the loss in terms of genuine grief, suggesting something in him had died alongside her. Biographers and psychologists examining these accounts since have offered various interpretations of what this attachment might have represented for Tesla emotionally. Some have suggested the pigeons offered a form of connection and purpose during years when his human relationships had grown considerably thinner than during his earlier, more socially active decades. Others point to the relationship as consistent with broader patterns of intense, specific attachment that had characterized aspects of his personality throughout his life. Whatever the underlying explanation, the pigeons occupied a place in his emotional life that visitors and correspondents from this period could not easily overlook. Alongside these attachments, Tesla's withdrawal from broader public and social life grew increasingly pronounced as this decade wore on. He accepted fewer invitations to dinners and gatherings that had once been a regular feature of his life in New York. His circle of active friendships narrowed, partly through natural attrition as contemporaries aged or passed away, and partly through his own increasing preference for solitude over social engagement. The gregarious, if eccentric, public figure of earlier decades was giving way to someone considerably more reclusive. His living situation continued its familiar pattern of movement between hotels, though the underlying reasons grew somewhat more complicated than pure financial difficulty alone. Some accounts suggest certain establishments grew uncomfortable with the presence of pigeons in his rooms, an arrangement that inevitably created cleaning and maintenance complications hotel management found difficult to accommodate indefinitely. Tesla, unwilling to compromise on caring for the birds he had rescued or grown attached to, sometimes chose relocation over abandoning these commitments. It represented, in its own way, a continuation of the stubbornness that had characterized him throughout his career, now redirected toward considerably smaller stakes. Correspondence from friends and acquaintances during this period increasingly registered concern about Tesla's isolation and his apparent prioritization of these attachments and rituals over more conventional social and professional engagement. Some worried that his behavior suggested a mind increasingly disconnected from the practical concerns that might have helped stabilize his difficult financial situation. Others viewed his eccentricities more charitably, as the understandable, even endearing idiosyncrasies of a genuinely brilliant mind that had simply never operated according to entirely conventional rules. Both perspectives likely captured some genuine truth about a genuinely complicated man. Despite this deepening isolation, Tesla remained intellectually engaged with scientific questions throughout these years, continuing correspondence with various institutions and occasionally publishing articles touching on his ongoing theoretical interests. He wrote about atomic structure, about cosmic rays, and about various speculative technologies he believed remained achievable given sufficient resources and attention. These writings, however, generated considerably less traction within mainstream scientific circles than his earlier, more established contributions had commanded decades before. The gap between his continued ambition and his diminishing platform for pursuing it only widened further. Financial hardship persisted alongside these deepening eccentricities, forming a difficult combination that friends found increasingly hard to address effectively. Attempts by acquaintances to help manage his finances more responsibly, or to encourage him toward more commercially viable projects, generally met with limited success. Tesla remained committed to his own particular vision of how he wished to spend his remaining time and resources, regardless of how impractical that vision might have appeared to more conventionally minded observers. His stubbornness, an asset during his years of greatest achievement, now sometimes worked against his own basic well-being. The pigeons, the numerical rituals, and the increasing preference for solitude together painted a portrait of a man whose extraordinary mind had, in certain respects, turned inward during these later years, where once his restless energy had been directed toward transforming how the entire world generated and distributed electrical power. It now found expression in far smaller, more private domains. This shift struck contemporaries as simultaneously poignant and somewhat troubling, a diminishment that seemed to mirror his broader retreat from public prominence and financial stability. Yet within these smaller domains, Tesla appeared to find something resembling genuine peace, however incomprehensible that peace looked from the outside. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, these established patterns of isolation, ritual, and attachment would only deepen further, even as broader economic circumstances began creating additional pressures Tesla had not yet fully confronted. The Great Depression, still on the horizon as this chapter closes, would soon test his already precarious financial situation in ways that made the difficulties of the previous decade look comparatively manageable. Whatever stability his rituals and attachments provided him personally, they offered no protection against the economic forces about to reshape the world around him. The hardest years of his long decline were still ahead. Chapter 15: The Quiet Decline. The stock market crash of 1929 and the depression that followed hit Tesla's already precarious finances with considerable additional force. Whatever modest income he had relied on from consulting work, royalties, and occasional patron generosity grew even scarcer as the broader economy contracted around him. Hotel bills, always a struggle to cover consistently, became harder still to manage during years when money had become tight for nearly everyone. Tesla, now well into his 70s, faced these hardships with far less capacity to recover through new ventures than he might have had decades earlier. Westinghouse Electric, honoring its founder's old friendship with Tesla even years after George Westinghouse's death, reportedly continued providing some manner of financial support during this especially difficult period. This assistance, modest as it likely was, helped Tesla maintain at least a baseline of stability, even as broader circumstances grew increasingly harsh. Without such support, his situation during these years might well have become considerably more dire than the accounts that survive already suggest. Even generous support, however, could not restore anything resembling his earlier financial independence. Public attention toward Tesla during the 1930s took an interesting, somewhat contradictory shape, combining genuine continued fascination with an increasingly wistful, retrospective quality. Newspapers marked his birthday with growing regularity, treating these occasions as opportunities to check in on a figure many readers remembered as one of the era's defining inventive minds. Tesla welcomed these interviews, using them to discuss both his historical achievements and his continued, if largely unrealized, ambitions for future inventions. The tone of these pieces, though respectful, often carried an undercurrent suggesting his most productive years belonged clearly to the past. One particularly persistent thread running through this period involved recurring rumors and speculation regarding a possible Nobel Prize. Reports circulated on more than one occasion suggesting Tesla might share the physics prize alongside Thomas Edison, a pairing that would have carried considerable symbolic weight given their earlier rivalry decades before. These rumors generated genuine excitement within Tesla's circle of friends and admirers each time they resurfaced. Ultimately, however, no such prize materialized for either man during these years, and the precise reasons behind the rumors never receiving official confirmation remain somewhat unclear even to historians studying the period closely. Tesla's own reaction to these unrealized Nobel rumors reportedly mixed genuine disappointment with a certain wounded pride regarding the potential pairing with Edison specifically. Given their long history of professional rivalry and personal friction dating back to the disputed $50,000 promise decades earlier, sharing such recognition with Edison struck Tesla as an uncomfortable irony rather than a purely welcome honor. Whether he would have accepted such a shared prize graciously had it actually been offered remains an open question that history never required him to answer. The rumors faded, eventually without ever producing any formal resolution. Financial hardship during these Depression years occasionally forced difficult, humbling situations that contrasted sharply with Tesla's earlier decades of prominence and relative prosperity. Accounts describe him struggling at various points to cover even modest daily expenses, relying increasingly on the generosity of friends, admirers, and institutions sympathetic to his historical contributions. The Institute of Immigrant Welfare, among other organizations, reportedly provided him with an award and modest financial recognition during this period, acknowledging his standing as one of America's most distinguished immigrant scientists. Such gestures offered symbolic honor more than substantial financial relief. Tesla continued his pigeon-feeding rituals and other established habits throughout these difficult years, maintaining these particular commitments even as broader circumstances grew increasingly constrained. He moved between hotels as needed, negotiating arrangements that allowed him to continue caring for birds, despite the complications this sometimes created with management. These routines, whatever concern they generated among friends who worried about his overall well-being, appeared to provide him with continued structure and purpose during years otherwise defined by diminishing prospects. He seemed unwilling to abandon them regardless of mounting practical pressure to do so. Occasional press coverage during this decade continued to explore Tesla's more speculative scientific claims, including his persistent interest in concepts related to what journalists sometimes sensationalized as death rays or particle beam weapons. Tesla discussed these ideas in interviews with evident seriousness, describing theoretical devices capable of projecting concentrated energy across considerable distances. Whether these concepts represented genuinely viable engineering possibilities or increasingly speculative extensions of his earlier legitimate work remains debated among historians and scientists who have examined his later writings. The press, regardless of technical feasibility, found such stories reliably compelling copy. Various governments reportedly expressed interest in Tesla's death ray concepts during the tense international climate of the 1930s, as nations across the world began preparing more seriously for the possibility of renewed large-scale conflict. Tesla corresponded with representatives from several countries regarding these ideas, though none of these discussions produced any functioning weapon or significant financial arrangement during his lifetime. Some biographers have questioned how far Tesla's actual technical designs extended beyond theoretical speculation and confident rhetoric. The full truth of these later technical claims remains difficult to establish given the incomplete documentation that survives from this period. Despite these financial and reputational struggles, Tesla's underlying scientific curiosity never fully dimmed throughout this decade, even as his practical capacity to pursue new large-scale projects diminished considerably. He continued corresponding with scientific institutions, occasionally submitting theoretical papers, and maintaining his characteristic confidence regarding the eventual significance of his various unfinished projects and speculative claims. Friends who visited him during these years often remarked on his continued mental sharpness, even as his physical health and financial circumstances grew increasingly precarious. The mind, it seemed, remained considerably younger than the body and bank accounts surrounding it. His birthday interviews, an increasingly reliable annual feature of American newspapers throughout this decade, gave Tesla a platform to reflect on his life's work while also speculating about scientific developments he believed still lay ahead for humanity. He discussed atomic energy, space travel, and various forms of wireless technology with the same expansive confidence that had characterized his thinking throughout his career. Readers responded with a mixture of genuine admiration and gentle skepticism, treating him as something between a respected elder statesman of science and an endearingly eccentric relic of an earlier technological age. Tesla, for his part, seemed to accept this complicated public role without significant complaint. Health concerns began emerging more prominently during the latter portion of this decade, adding physical vulnerability to the financial and social difficulties Tesla had already been navigating for years. He suffered a heart episode at one point during these years, an event serious enough to draw genuine concern from friends and briefly renewed press attention regarding his overall condition. He recovered characteristically with enough resilience to continue his established routines once the immediate health crisis had passed. The episode nonetheless served as a reminder that his considerable age was beginning to catch up with him in ways his stubborn will alone could not entirely overcome. By the close of the 1930s, as the world moved inexorably toward another devastating global conflict, Tesla remained a figure simultaneously celebrated and pitied within American public consciousness. His historical contributions to electrification remained undeniable and increasingly recognized as foundational to modern civilization itself. His present circumstances, however, reflected years of financial struggle, professional disappointment, and increasing physical and social isolation. The gap between these two realities, the celebrated past and the diminished present, had become one of the defining features of how the public understood him during his final active years. Tesla entered the new decade carrying both his considerable historical legacy and his ongoing personal struggles into circumstances that would soon become considerably more constrained still. advancing age, persistent financial hardship, and the deepening rituals that had come to structure his daily existence all pointed toward a life increasingly narrowed in scope, even as his mind continued reaching toward theoretical questions as expansive as ever. The final years awaiting him would test whatever resilience remained after decades of triumph, conflict, and gradual decline. What came next would bring his long, extraordinary life to its quiet, largely solitary conclusion. Chapter 16: The Last Room. By 1940, Tesla had settled into what would become his final residence, a modest room on the 33rd floor of the New Yorker Hotel. Room 332 offered him little beyond basic comfort, a considerable distance from the grand accommodations of his earlier, more prosperous decades. He lived there quietly, maintaining his established routines as best his advancing age and limited resources allowed. The room itself would soon become inseparable from how history remembers his final years. His daily life during this period followed a narrow, familiar pattern built around feeding pigeons, corresponding occasionally with old friends and admirers, and reflecting on decades of scientific work behind him. Hotel staff grew accustomed to his presence, treating him with a mixture of respect and gentle accommodation, given his advanced age and diminished circumstances. He rarely left the immediate vicinity of the hotel, except for his regular visits to feed birds in nearby parks. The expansive, globe-spanning ambitions of his younger years had narrowed, by necessity and perhaps by choice, to this considerably smaller daily orbit. Financial support during these final years continued arriving through a combination of modest sources, including ongoing assistance connected to Westinghouse Electric and occasional gestures from admirers aware of his historical significance. This support kept him housed and fed, though it provided nothing resembling the resources that might have allowed renewed pursuit of his larger scientific ambitions. Tesla accepted these arrangements with whatever grace his pride allowed, having grown accustomed over the preceding decade to depending on others for basic stability. It was a considerable distance from the man who had once negotiated directly with Morgan and Westinghouse as an equal. Health concerns grew more persistent as 1942 gave way to the early weeks of 1943, with Tesla's advanced age now approaching 87 years, making him increasingly vulnerable to the kind of decline that eventually catches up with even the most resilient constitution. He continued his established routines as best he could, though friends who saw him during these final months noted a growing frailty that had not been as apparent even a year or two earlier. Correspondence from this period grew sparser, reflecting both his diminishing energy and the narrowing circle of people still actively checking in on him. The end, though not yet officially arrived, was clearly approaching. On January 7, 1943, Nikola Tesla died alone in room 3327, discovered only after a hotel maid, growing concerned when he failed to answer his door as expected, entered the room and found him. He had asked not to be disturbed in the days immediately prior, a request that, in retrospect, may have delayed discovery of his passing by a day or more. The scene that greeted the maid was quiet and unremarkable, offering no dramatic final gesture befitting the extraordinary life that had just ended within it. He died, by most accounts, of heart failure, a fittingly undramatic conclusion to a life that had generated so much genuine drama and controversy across its many decades. News of his death spread quickly once discovered, generating obituaries and tributes across American and international newspapers that acknowledged, often for the first time in years, the full scope of his contributions to modern electrical infrastructure. Editorials reflected on his role in developing alternating current, in illuminating the Chicago World's Fair, and in helping harness Niagara Falls for large-scale power generation. Many pieces also touched, with varying degrees of sympathy, on his later years of financial hardship and eccentric isolation. The tone across much of this coverage carried genuine respect, mixed with a certain wistful acknowledgement of how far his circumstances had fallen from his earlier prominence. In the days immediately following his death, something unusual occurred that would fuel speculation and controversy for decades afterward. Agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, acting through the Office of Alien Property Custodian, given wartime concerns about Tesla's papers and their potential military significance, moved quickly to seize the contents of his hotel room and various safe deposit boxes. This action reflected genuine anxiety, reasonable enough given the ongoing war, that Tesla's notes might contain information of value to enemy powers, particularly given his earlier speculation about death rays and other advanced weapons concepts. The seizure nonetheless struck many observers as a jarring, almost undignified coda to a life that deserved a more respectful conclusion. Sava Kosanovich, Tesla's nephew, arrived in New York attempting to secure his uncle's papers and belongings on behalf of the family, only to find that government agents had already taken possession of much of the material before he could intervene. This created lasting tension and confusion regarding exactly what happened to various documents, prototypes, and personal effects in the immediate aftermath of Tesla's death. Some materials were eventually returned to the family, while others remained subject to government review for considerably longer periods. The full contents and ultimate fate of everything seized during this period remain, even now, a subject of occasional historical debate and speculation. Tesla's funeral took place at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, drawing a notable assembly of scientists, dignitaries, and admirers, despite his relatively diminished public profile during his final years. Tributes read at the service acknowledged both his groundbreaking scientific contributions and the more complicated, sometimes difficult personal journey that had accompanied them. Telegrams of condolence arrived from prominent scientists and even from foreign governments recognizing his considerable international reputation. It was, in its solemnity and scale, a fitting final public acknowledgement of a life that had shaped the physical infrastructure of the modern world. In the years immediately following his death, Tesla's reputation underwent a gradual but genuine transformation, moving from that of a somewhat forgotten, eccentric figure toward increasing recognition as one of history's truly pivotal inventors. Legal proceedings regarding his radio patents, still unresolved at the time of his death, finally reached a conclusion in 1943 when the United States Supreme Court upheld several of his key patents, effectively recognizing his foundational contributions to radio technology ahead of Marconi's later refinements. This vindication arrived only months after his death, too late for him to witness directly, yet significant nonetheless in confirming claims he had defended for decades against considerable skepticism. His alternating current system, meanwhile, had long since become the invisible backbone of electrical infrastructure across the United States and much of the world, powering homes, businesses, and industries in ways so thoroughly integrated into daily life that most people using it gave no thought whatsoever to its origins. The very ordinariness of this success represented, in its own way, the deepest possible vindication of everything Tesla had once argued against considerable resistance from Edison and his allies. What had once seemed like a radical, dangerous alternative to established direct current infrastructure had become, decades later, simply how electricity worked, everywhere, without controversy or debate. Decades after his death, Tesla's name experienced a further resurgence in public recognition, driven partly by growing historical scholarship examining his full contributions, and partly by broader cultural fascination with his colorful, often tragic personal story. Museums, documentaries, and popular books increasingly told his story to audiences who had grown up entirely unaware of how significant his early work had been to the electrical systems surrounding them daily. A major electric vehicle company would eventually adopt his name directly, introducing an entirely new generation to at least the surface outline of his historical significance. This late, considerable fame arrived generations after the actual struggles and triumphs that had earned it. Looking back across the full arc of his life, from a lightning-struck birth in a small mountain village to a lonely death in a Manhattan hotel room, Tesla's story resists easy summary or simple moral lessons. He achieved genuine, world-altering technical triumphs, reshaping how humanity generates and distributes electrical power in ways that remain fundamental to modern civilization. He also experienced genuine, repeated failure, watching ambitious projects collapse for want of funding, watching credit for his ideas sometimes flow toward others, and watching his final decades unfold in circumstances far more modest than his earlier achievements might have suggested. Both halves of the story remain equally true, inseparable from each other in any honest accounting of his life. What endures most clearly, perhaps, is the sheer scale of imaginative ambition that characterized him from that first sketch drawn in Budapest dirt through his final theoretical writings decades later. He rarely thought in modest terms, whether contemplating a motor design, a power station, or a system for transmitting electricity wirelessly across the entire globe. This same expansive imagination that produced his greatest triumphs also, at times, outpaced what available technology and financing could realistically support. It remains difficult to separate the visionary from the overreach, since both emerged from precisely the same restless, unusually gifted mind. Perhaps that difficulty itself is the truest measure of who Nikola Tesla actually was.